from England. And in the first few days, he was just totally flabbergasted, and he admitted that his whole world changed within just a day or two of his encounter. And he said if he had later found a little more skeptical information, he would have become very, very credulous. So there's a whole range of investigators who, once they have committed, they no longer are nearly so concerned with their controls and ruling out sensory cues and statistical artifacts. It's something people have to continually guard against. And the only way to do that is to have a sympathetic yet critical community who can engage in peer review, sometimes behind-the-scenes confrontation, sometimes you have to go public.
I think we've left out the most important category of all, which is practical jokes. And there was a wonderful book published in the late 1940s by H. Allen Smith called The Complete Practical Joker. It is a hilarious book, and he covers especially the career of Hugh Troy, a man who did marvelous practical jokes. When there was an exhibit of Van Gogh's paintings, Hugh Troy took an old piece of old hamburger, and he fashioned an ear out of it. And he put this in a cushioned box. And then he made up a little sign, very fancy sign, painted, Van Gogh's ear. And he slipped this into the museum that had the Van Gogh exhibit and put it on a table. And crowds were gathering around, looking at Van Gogh's ear.
I'm sure that you also want to hear about the Fugo balloons from Japan. We have a lot of new Fugo information. For those of you who've never heard of the Fugo balloons, at the end of the Second World War, the Japanese had this scheme of bombing the United States with balloons. And they built 9,000 balloons. And they filled them with hydrogen, which is very explosive, and loaded them down with bombs and sent them across the Pacific, which was 3,000 miles, by the Gulf Stream. And some of these balloons actually reached the United States and dropped their bombs on the United States. And these balloons, most of them self-destructed. They were designed to self-destruct. But a couple of hundred of them, for various reasons, did not self-destruct. And they landed in different parts of the West, especially, and where the government retrieved them. And this started a lot of the rumors of government secrecy and strange objects coming out of the sky. And the Japanese call these balloons Fugo balloons. And as I've pointed out before and in some articles, it's very likely that what was found at Roswell, New Mexico, was the remains of a Fugo balloon. There are 7 museums in the United States that have a display of Fugo balloons. The Smithsonian had a fully rigged Fugo balloon on display for some years. And some of the museums in Oregon and Washington have Fugo balloon material on display. So anyone who reads the books on Roswell, if you're really interested in it, you can go to one of these museums and see the kind of material that was found at Roswell, because it fits the description of the Roswell witnesses exactly. Only at Roswell did they think that it was something else. Usually when they find a Fugo balloon, people are smart enough to figure out, gee, it must be a balloon. At Roswell, they said, gee, it must be a flying saucer. We're still finding these damn things. In North Dakota in 1990, they found one in the Black Hills. It had probably been there for 45 years. And they found the remains of it. Of course, after 45 years, a lot of it just rotted away. But they found enough so they could identify it as a Fugo balloon. In 1990, the Japanese television network sent a camera team to the United States, and they toured the United States. And they interviewed all the Fugo balloon witnesses who were still alive. There were a lot of them. And then they did a 2-hour documentary on Fugo balloons on December 7th, 1991. And their approach was, gee, we're sorry we did this. And the Japanese school children last year made thousands of origami origami birds and things out of paper, and sent this to Oregon, to the state of Oregon, as a gift in tribute to the people. Some people in Oregon had been killed by these bombs, as a tribute to these people who had died in the Fugo balloon attacks. There is a college professor here in the United States he's Japanese and I can't pronounce his name, but he's sort of made a hobby out of the Fugo balloons, and he's the leading expert on it, and he's talked to all the witnesses. After I did some articles on it, we got some strange letters from people who recalled seeing these during the war and after the war. And I got 3 letters in particular that are very interesting and that was now checking out. People who claimed that some of these balloons were manned, and they saw these balloons. One woman was living near Hanford, which is an atomic bomb plant, and she saw this balloon very close to the ground, and there was something in it that she thought at first was a monkey. And when she got closer to it, she realized that it was a little man. And of course, Japanese were small in stature, and if you're going to build balloons to cross the Pacific, you want a small person, lightweight person, to be in them. And she said that right after she watched this balloon bounce across the landscape and fly away, several jeeps pulled up with American soldiers in them, and one of the officers asked her not to mention this to anybody. This was a practice at the time. They didn't want the Japanese to find out that these balloons were getting here, and so they kept most of it out of the newspapers. And this started, in a way, a lot of our Men in Black kind of stories that we later heard in the UFO field. Because the FBI also would call students together in a schoolroom and warn them that these balloon bombs were coming, and that if they ever saw one, they should not, spread the news. They should keep it to themselves. One of these balloons did get into a very small newspaper out west, and within 2 weeks, the story appeared in the Japanese newspapers in Japan. That's how good their spy system was. So the government plan to keep it a secret was quite effective. And there are books about this secrecy, very well documented books. There's one by a man named Bert Weber called The Silent Siege. But if the Japanese were able to send over even a few manned balloons, then we would have another explanation for a lot of the stories that came out immediately after the war of the government picking up little men from the desert and so on. There are a number of these stories are being revived now by the Roswell fans. It's very likely that maybe a dozen of these balloons had been manned, because they were planning to do that on a big scale, but they never did it. That is, they didn't send over thousands of balloons with men in them, but they may have sent over a few, half dozen or a dozen, just to see if it would work. And that's probably what all of these stories are about. We know that there was one crash saucer story from Mexico that was a Fugo balloon story, but at the time, nobody knew about Fugo balloons, and the American Army went into Mexico and carried out the remains of the Fugo balloon. And the story appears in Frank Scully's book, which was published in 1950.
I went to New York when I was 17, and within a very short time I was editor of a poetry magazine, and also at that time television was just starting up. One of the first stations was WABD, and it was in the old Wanamaker building, which was a department store. And in the basement of the department store, they set up a very primitive television station. And everybody there in the station worked for nothing and very close to it, because television was very primitive and only a handful of people had TV sets. Well, I used to hang around there, and I was working on a newspaper, and I would hang around there in my spare time and watch how everything was going, and they finally started paying me $4 a week. So that was big salary in television.
So I really was a pioneer in television.
And here we all knew that television was going to be really big. But the Korean War started, and my natural patriotic instinct was to defend my country and become a big war hero. In other words, they caught me trying to cross the Canadian border. And they dragged me into the army. They shipped all the black guys to Korea, and they shipped all the white guys to Europe. And Europe was a pretty good place to go.
We got our orders, which is a sheet of paper with nothing but gobbledygook on it. Unless you know what all these phrases and initials mean, you don't know where you're going and how you're going to get there and what they're going to do to you when you do get there. So our orders said we were going to the 7707 AFN company, and nobody knew what the hell that was. So I go, figure out I'm going to be doing autopsies. So we arrived in Frankfurt, and all these soldiers got off the train, and there were fleets of trucks waiting for them. And they all climbed into the backs of the trucks. But we couldn't find our truck. George and I were running around saying, where the hell is the AFN company? And a limousine pulled up. Honest to God, a limousine pulled up, and a German driver got out. And the Germans in those days, they probably still do, they loved uniforms. This guy was wearing big boots and a big leather coat. And he said, is this hair keel? And I said, yeah, and he'd come for us. So we got into the limousine. All these other soldiers that we had ridden on the train with, they were pretty disgusted. So we got into the limousine, started off going outside of Frankfurt, and we asked the driver, are we going to live in a tent? He said, no, you live in a castle. He pulled into a town called Herbst, and there was a bloody castle. And it was the Von Brunning Castle. Now, we had a system in those days, and the Army had a system, where, Germany was absolutely leveled, but anything that was standing, the U.S. Army took it. And they seized this castle and turned it into a radio station. That was what AFN stood for, was the American Forces Network. And we were suddenly, our basic training had been a terrible nightmare. And now we were suddenly living in luxury. And we had a maid who came in and made our beds and swept the floors and everything. And our cooks in the Army mess hall there didn't serve Army food. They traded it on the German black market for steaks and things. And they were very good cooks. They were carefully selected cooks.
So George was assigned to the newsroom of the radio station. By the way, this is probably the biggest radio network in the world at that time. And I was assigned to production. And I was to produce radio shows. I knew a little bit about television, but I didn't know much about radio. So naturally, they made me a big shot there. Now, in 1951, I was doing a lot of shows. For example, we had a show called something like a Profile of a Leader. And we were supposed to do a program every week about one of the generals living in Europe. And so they had the dullest biographies. They went to this school and that school, and a few of them had been in an actual battle. And after a while, we got pretty fed up with these dull biographies, and we started inventing generals. And nobody ever caught on to it. And from then on, every week you heard machine guns going, and the general saved his whole command. And nobody ever questioned it. And this station was heard all over Europe, and including England. When my 2 years in the Army was up, I had a big debate with myself. By this time, I had a German girlfriend. Incidentally, because of the war, most of the young men our ages had been killed German